Well,
Yeah.
that's how I wanted to start. I was recently, we built some new bookshelves. You can't see them through that door because it's kind of,
Mm.
you might be able to see them, but
It's kind of dark. Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
very dark. And the books behind me aren't what I'm talking about. Anyway, and I'm like, finally got all my books out because of some of them were in storage.
Hmm.
And because I moved into a house about a year and a half ago in with my partner. And
Hmm.
I, I've been going through well, first we're going to talk, of course, in depth about your new book,
Yeah.
George Cukor,
Hmm.
George Cukor's People. But I'm like looking through things, and this isn't even all the ones I've read, Joe. They've got the book you did with Michael John Ford.
Hmm.
We have this one, which was I think this your
Lubitsch.
last book. If I might be mistaken. Maybe Billy
Uh,
Wilder was more recent.
no, I've done,
Billy
I
Wilder.
did a book on the Coen brothers too, a little
Well,
bit.
we talked about that one
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. And I did with Bill Wilder, and then before that, Lubitsch.
Lubitsch, right? So the
Yeah.
Billy Wilder.
Yeah. Great.
And then on I caught up finally a couple of years ago with that.
Oh, good.
And
Good.
then the real whole reason when I discovered you years ago was, of course, for John Ford. And
Oh, wonderful.
yeah, I've read all those. Plus, I read the one about your whole experience with Robert Gottlieb and
Oh, yeah.
Janine
Yeah. Basinger. Yeah.
Basinger, rather. And I
Yes.
there might even be another book out there that I read on which I may be forgetting. But the point is, not one of these is signed, Joe.
Oh,
Not one of them is signed. So maybe now that you'll have more free time.
yeah. Yeah. Where do
And
you live?
I'm in New York State.
What, what city in New York?
I'm not in a city. I'm in anymore. I was in New York City, although the last time we talked about Coen brothers, and we might have split it between Billy and the Coen brothers, but I was already up here in the Hudson Valley, and I
Mm.
still am. And
Mm. Well,
yeah,
if I ever get up there, I've been meaning to go to New York City, but I was going to go when the pandemic hit, and I haven't gone since,
yeah.
But I haven't been to upstate New York, actually. I haven't been. I've been to Long Island. That's as far as I've gone.
Well, that's not. Yeah, that's
That's
east of New York City,
yeah,
and we're north of New York City, but it's a beautiful spot, Joe. Yeah, I mean, it's so pretty, and it's very
yeah.
special place where we are. It's gorgeous and
Wow.
break a lot of arts, a lot of film,
Okay.
and a lot of music, and it's a really great place to live. Now, I have another question before we get into Cukor in more detail, though. I do want to know is like how what is your what is your ritual? What is your I mean, do you write every day?
Yeah. Usually, uh, certainly when I'm working on a book. I mean, we could talk about that process if you want. I mean,
I
I
do
take
want to because you're so prolific that
yeah,
maybe you don't think so but it seems like
yeah,
every
yeah.
3 years or something there's like this tome
Well,
that you publish, which
this
is
has
so
been the
incredible.
most prolific period of my life, actually.
Yes.
Part of it, though, I spend a lot of time thinking about books before I really sit down and write them, and I take a lot of notes. And Cukor, Wilder, those guys I've been writing about for like 50 years, and
Lubitsch.
Lubitsch finally got around to writing a book on them. But I wrote some articles about Cukor and Wilder way back when, and
Hmm.
like they've been on my mind for a long time. And then you just focus on, okay, I'm going to do this book now, and then I have a very laser like focus once I get going on something. Very disciplined.
You are.
Yeah, yeah.
So what so how do you I mean you got the class, right?
Well, I've been, when I first started teaching, I found it kind of distracting, so I wasn't writing books as fast as I am now. But after a while, I realized I could come home and after teaching, I could start working. I work late at night. I'm a night owl,
You
and
are.
I work from late evening into the wee hours of the morning quite often. It's a good time to work because there's nobody around. It's
Right.
no distractions. You aren't tempted to go out to the store or whatever. And so I've been, I had four books that came out in about a 4 month period in 2021 and 2022. It was partly coincidence that the Wilder book came out, and I had a book called Political Truth about the Kennedy assassination in the media, which I've been working on for a long time. That came out, and then the Coen brothers book, and then I did an update on the John Ford book that you have there. And that
Hmm.
all happened in about a 4 month period, which was kind of crazy. I was actually, the final stages of the book, you have a lot of proofreading and a lot of detail work to do. And I was getting confused, like, what book am I working on now?
Right. Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, wow. But it makes sense as I read. There is first of all, you have a certain style where you do insert yourself, which is one thing. The other thing is once you start reading an author, as I have, I mean, I've read there are other film authors I've read multiple books of theirs. You probably hold the record because of in part of how prolific you've been since I first met you. So now I feel like, I like almost I need to read you because I kind of feel like we have a relationship on a certain level. But there's like one master story out there, Hollywood, and then you know
Yeah.
there's like a Venn diagram of all the different stories within there that you're telling. They overlap, they visit each other, they speak to each other on a certain
Yeah.
level. I mean,
Yeah.
there's definitely references to other work you've done because
Yeah.
there's,
Yeah.
there's, you know, usually the immigrant story is one sub story of top subject that comes up throughout, and how can you not in the early Hollywood? All the majority of directors were from other countries, or at least they were second generation
Mhm.
in almost every case.
Yeah. Kukar was
Um,
the son of Hungarian immigrants.
yeah, right. And so,
Um,
how does that make the process a little easier because you have built up such a library?
well,
And
oh,
by the
okay.
way, I want to tell people that are watching that behind you, the graphic, the image you have is on. I'm going to say on the left of you is George Cukor in his latter years, and to the far right is the right in the middle is some French filmmaker I've never heard of.
Yeah.
That's Truffaut, and then to the far right is a skinny, budding author. And you were not intentionally an actor. You kind of fell into some acting,
Mm.
but you were
Well, yeah,
um,
this was
you were an author.
1975. This was a party for Truffaut's Story of Adele H. Premiere in Hollywood, and
Wow,
Cukor came to the premiere, and I got to visit with Truffaut and Cukor, and Truffaut had been writing about Cukor as a young critic way back in the 50s, and the, I quote this in the book. It's kind of funny that,
he was a big fan. Yeah,
yeah, he was a fan. He wrote that Cukor is the kind of guy who makes five out of five films, one is a masterpiece, three are very good, and one is good. And he said,
I
but
love that.
the problem is with Cukor. He said, he's not the kind of director you write about. He's the kind of director you talk to your friends about on the street or in cafes. This is the way he put it. And so I was challenged by this kind of thing to, like, how do you write about Cukor? And there was another quote like that, Edward Buscombe, who's a good British critic. He said that Kucher's a brilliant director, but he said the problem is there is nothing to say about him. And then he kind of went on that he said Anglo, British American film criticism doesn't have the way of talking about Kucher. In other words, the vocabulary to deal with a director who is an auteur but didn't write his own films, and he worked through his actors, and he was very
Hence the title of your book. Yeah.
yeah, he was very explicit about I express myself through my actors, and he was so respectful of literary works that most of his films are adapted from plays, and he came from the theater like other directors, but he was so faithful to the text that he would carry around the pages for the day with him when he directed, and then they get all mangled up during the day, and he'd throw them out. But I'm a member of the Writers Guild of America. And we gave him an award around 1980 for his respect for writers, and I think that's unique in the history of the Writers Guild. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
could you imagine we gave an award to a director? That's kind of shocking in a way.
Well, he
But
always had a deep, as you're saying, a deep respect for the word, the written word, and it kind of goes back to uh his origins in film, right? Because he was actually started. He was there for the entire, almost the entirety of old Hollywood, right? Up to the modern day,
well,
because
the beginning
he
of
he
Talking
he
Pictures. Yeah.
started as he started as a of of helping directors, right? With because the silent period had ended,
Hmm.
and a number of the actors were having difficulty uh, transitioning to um, talkies, and they needed a coach, right, for a dialogue coach, essentially,
Right,
correct,
right,
or somebody
right.
who could help these people learn how to act while speaking. And a lot of those directors he was helping didn't have that experience, but he came from the theater, right? So he was able to kind of bring
Yeah.
that talent, and that's how he started in Hollywood. Is that right?
Yeah, he was called the dialogue
Yeah,
director on two
dialogue director.
films. First was a forgettable film called River of Romance, which was a Booth Tarkington play that was a clunky transposition to film. And he was brought out to help the director coach the cast in what was supposed to be a credible Southern accent. And he admitted he didn't really know a good Southern accent. And he says they speak with an ersatz Southern accent. But then he got the job of being the dialogue director on All Quiet on the Western Front, which is one of the great American films, 1930. Louis Milestone was the director, and
Okay.
he was the top director. He had already won
Yes.
one of the first Oscars, and but Cukor had the job for 6 months of helping him find young guys to play the soldiers in this
Right.
war movie about World War I, and he helped cast Lou Ayres, who became a star as a result of this film, give a wonderful performance, and then he would rehearse the actors. You know, a lot of them were kind of young and green, and he helped get them up to speed. He was pretty harsh, apparently, according to Ayres and another
Huh.
actor. He was he insisted on line readings, and really drilled them until they got it right. And he later became more diplomatic, and he directed Ayres again in Holiday in
Right.
1938, a wonderful performance. And
Yeah, where he played Katharine Hepburn's brother, I think.
yeah, he's a drunk, and he's one of the most memorable alcoholics in films.
Yeah.
And at that point, Ayres said, "Oh, he was a joy to work with. He didn't bother me at all. He was Cukor was very diplomatic. He used the word discretion a lot. He was discreet in his private life, being a queer or
Homosexual.
a
Yeah.
director. He was in the closet, although everybody in Hollywood, knew that he was gay, and nobody really minded. But he had to be circumspect about it. But
Yes.
he was not seeking a lot of personal publicity, which is one reason he wasn't as well known to the public as people like Capra or Ford or Hitchcock or whatever. But within the profession, he was held in high regard.
I I want to
Uh,
yeah, I don't want to skip it too far ahead either, because there's some questions I have, maybe pick your brain about, those early days um and of Hollywood, of film in America, and that is like the original, a lot of the films were adaptations, correct? From the theater. It felt like,
yeah,
especially the beginning of talkies, that there were a lot of, they were kind of shot like plays, and people
yeah,
spoke
yeah,
like they did on the stage. And it feels like maybe Cukor was one of those, was a rarity in the sense that he was able to kind of modernize
yeah,
and make film its own, medium, in the sense that you don't have to act like you do on the stage. This
yeah.
is a different medium, and we should treat it as such.
That's a key insight about Cukor. I mean, at first, when they had talking pictures, the camera had to be in a booth,
Right, right, right. Because
and
it
it
was
was
loud.
the machinery was noisy until they developed what do they
The
call it?
case. The
the
encasement.
case that
Yeah.
goes around it. I'm forgetting the
Right.
word, but the first couple of years, the cameraman would be inside this booth and it was really hot. People would sort of faint sometimes, and
Wow.
they couldn't do a lot of camera movement very easily. Although certain
I see.
directors move the camera, sometimes they had to move the whole booth, you know.
Right.
And also to get variety in shots, sometimes they'd have two or three cameras going in different booths at the same time, which is how television began to be shot when, you know, I Love Lucy pioneered the three camera TV setup with a silent film cameraman doing that. But so the early films like CUKOR'S film The Royal Family at Broadway, which is very funny and very well acted. It's a spoof of the Barrymore family, but it mostly takes place in one big set of their house, and it looks kind of like a TV sitcom because of that. And he admitted that it took him two or three films before he kind of figured out how to make the camera be expressive and move along with the actors, move in, move, you know, he had a very mobile camera in his films, but you don't really notice it like you do. And some directors really show off their camera work. But Cukor had long takes. That's one of the distinguishing things about his style. Takes that go on for 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes. Wonderful virtuosic takes that, you know, it's stunning to see the actors carry them off. And usually you know, I talked to him on numerous occasions, and I asked him about the long takes, and one thing he said was, well, if you have actors who come from the theater like Katharine
Hmm.
Hepburn and Laurence Olivier on his TV movie Love Among the Ruins, which is great, has some great long takes, he
His
said
last play,
they
or
can
his
do
last film.
these.
Hmm.
Well, not quite, but it was one of his later
One
ones.
of his last.
Yeah, he said they come from the theater and they can handle the long dialogue scenes, and so the camera is moving around them, and but you don't really notice it unless you're a film buff, you know, and studying the camera work. And most, but I said, you know, why do you like doing that? And he said, well, for one thing, it makes it seem more real and less acted, which is an interesting comment, and it goes along with what you observed that he taught Hollywood how to speak more naturally. And Charles Brackett, who became known as a screenwriter with Billy Wilder,
Billy Wilder. Yeah.
said Cukor was the guy who taught us all how to do dialogue on film. You know, it's quite a feather in his cap. That Cukor taught us about cinematic dialogue, and it's kind of like I tell my screenwriting students. I've been a screenwriter too. Dialogue should be sort of overheard and not declaimed like in the theater. You know, it's you kind of want to, like you're eavesdropping on the characters and they're
Like yeah,
speaking naturally. Yeah.
I guess Robert Altman took that to more an extreme.
Yeah, he did, and he had microphones all over the set and everything, and he did some innovative work with sound as Francis Ford Coppola has and other people. And but Cukor was there doing that stuff at the beginning, but they had not only dialogue directors, but when he got a chance to direct on his own, he was given a co-director on a couple of films. These were guys who were more used to the camera, and so he did a
Hmm.
couple of rather clunky early films. His first film as a director is called Grumpy, and it had a co-director. And boy, that one is really ponderous. It's a play,
Oh, I
but
haven't seen it.
really a drag. But the Royal Family Broadway holds up, and it's a lot of fun. It's a zippy play. It's by George S. Kaufman and Edna Ferber, and it's got Ina Claire, who was one of Cooper's favorite actresses, who was a stage star but didn't make a lot of films, but she's wonderful. And
Hmm.
Frederick March does a
Mm.
terrific spoof of John Barrymore. And John Barrymore himself appreciated that. He said he made him into a terrible, conceited hound, and it's one of the greatest performances I've ever seen. You know, Ethel Barrymore was so upset she was going to sue them, but John Barrymore thought it was a hoot. You know, and then Cukor eventually didn't need help anymore, and he was on his own, and he started making some very mobile films. You know, King Vidor, who was one of his contemporaries, but he came from silent films. He said, "I never would have had the guts, in a sense, to do some of the plays that you did on film because, you know, I wouldn't know how to make them seem like moving pictures. You know, but he
Hmm.
said you somehow you keep it moving, and Cukor said late in life, one of the first things I learned was that, on the stage, people get up and walk around just for variety, but in the films that you have to feel you're kind of in the midst of the action,
Hmm.
and the camera is observing and eavesdropping on people. And he said the camera should be kind of moving a lot and in motion, and there's a lot of discrete unobtrusive motion in CUKOR'S films, and also the movement of the characters is very natural. Martin Scorsese mentions that, and he also says, it's really hard to explain what Cukor does, but I really admire what he does. But so I took all this as a challenge. You were asking about how I wrote this thing. Back in 1971, I wrote my first piece on Cukor. I was reviewing a book on Cukor, and I said he's really hard to
Was this the
analyze. Hmm?
was this the I'm trying to remember the author's name of that
You're
book.
thinking of Gavin Lambert's
Gavin
interview book.
Lambert, who
Yeah,
I
no,
guess wrote. This was
I,
before that.
this is another book, but Gavin Lambert did a wonderful interview book in 1972 called On Cukor, which is delightful. And I
I
knew
think I
Gavin. Gavin was a great film buff and a biographer, fiction writer, screenwriter, and they had a terrific conversation. Um, but I was trying to figure out how to write about Cukor, and I said, how do you capture the moment by moment body language and verbalizations and looks on the faces of people like Judy Garland in A Star Is Born, and then I mentioned that great scene in the dressing room where she's breaking down because she's trying to talk to the studio boss, Charles Bickford, about her drunken husband and confessing that she doesn't know what to do with him. And it's so heartrending to deal with somebody you love who's falling apart. And then she says, sometimes I hate him and I hate myself. It's a great scene.
it's a very raw
Very,
performance, and
very
and
raw.
um you refer to it as not only one of the maybe his greatest masterpiece, even though it was kind of butchered by the studio, right, with that caveat, but you also put it out there just as one of the greatest films. Sounds like one of your favorites of all time.
Yeah, I think, if I had to pick the top 20 films of all time, it would be on that list. Um, I did my top 10 films for Sight and Sound in 2022. Every 10 years they do a list, and I put it on the list there. I think it reaches emotional depths that very few films do. I think Ingmar Bergman does. He really delves into the human personality very deeply. And John Huston's documentary "Let There Be Light," which is about shell-shocked soldiers in an
Hmm.
army hospital, which I liberated from the government, really gets into tremendous emotional depth. But Cukor did that with his films, and he was able to. I mean, he had a light touch, and he said, I always bring humor to things wherever possible, but he could also transition very easily and naturally to, as you say, raw emotional depths with somebody like
And
a Judy Garland or James Mason.
right, and in other films within the actual film itself, he can go from one tone to another, very,
Yeah,
which is not easy to do, and a lot of films and filmmakers don't pull it off quite so well. And it's often the problem with a film can be the tone because they're trying to handle, a range of emotional performance, and but Cukor seemed to be able to do it with what seemed some effortlessness. I'm sure there was a great amount of effort, in fact, but he it was a talent of his, right?
yes, and he said the director's main function is to be the audience. And Orson Welles, who I worked with for 5 years as an actor, he put me in The Other Side of the Wind. I was a non-actor, and he put me in playing a role that was kind of a spoof of myself as an earnest young film critic in this Hollywood party, following John Huston around. I got to learn about acting from being an actor for Wells, which I think really helped me to write this book. But Wells said the same thing. He said the director is just the audience. He said he supplies what's missing in the making of a motion picture, which is the audience. In the theater, people are in front of you and they laugh or they react emotionally or whatever, and you can get energy from that. But on a film set, you have the crew who can't react because they can't laugh. They have to do their job. But so the actors are very dependent on the director as the barometer of what they should be doing, and also
Uh,
the level of intensity. How intense should each moment be? And as you say, these transitions from humor to sentiment to pain and raw emotion has to be calibrated very carefully, and somebody has to have great taste. A great actor's director like Cukor has great taste, and also the rhythm and the pacing of all the scenes is in the director's command, and that's part of what
Well, and I have an overall
makes
vision for the film.
right. Yeah, Ingmar Bergman said what makes a great director is a personal vision.
Hmm.
And that's the dilemma with Cukor, writing about Cukor, as I go into in my introduction. With the auteur theory, there's a misconception that people have in America generally that an auteur is somebody who writes as well as directs his or her own film.
Right.
People like Woody Allen or Orson Welles or
John
Ingmar
Cassavetes.
Bergman, Cassavetes, yeah. But the French critics like Truffaut and Godard and Bazin, they designed the politique des auteurs, they called it the policy of authors, to account for directors like Cukor or Raoul Walsh, who didn't write their own movies. And also Hitchcock and Lubitsch, although Hitchcock actually, he and his wife, Alma Revel, worked on the writing of all their pictures, and then they would call in a screenwriter to write the dialogue and
Oh,
flesh out the characters. But
interesting.
Cukor didn't pretend to be a writer, although he participated in the shaping of the scripts. He would usually get the choice of good material. Sometimes he had to take second-rate material, but usually he got the best properties, and then he would work with the screenwriter and kind of talk through the project, what it needed to be turned into a film. He worked with people like Donald Ogden Stewart, who was a top screenwriter, and Zoe Akins, Jane Murfin, Anita Luz, Ruth Gordon, and Garson Kanin, who
Right.
wrote,
So it's a lot of,
yeah.
right, and being able to identify great partners and create successful relationships
Yeah, and
can really be.
he respected them. Like if he was on the set with the Tracy Hepburn film, and Gordon and Kanan were back home in Connecticut, and they realized we need a few lines of dialogue here, he would stop everything and get on the phone to them and say, "We need, Tracy to do blah 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 blah," and they would call back half an hour later with the lines. He wouldn't. I mean, sometimes he'd let Tracy does ad lib a few lines in the Cukor films, but Cukor didn't encourage that promiscuous ad libbing that some directors do. But he would involve the writers as much as possible so that it wouldn't get out of control. And but he made it seem natural. Like Adam's Rib is a wonderful screenplay by Gordon and Kanan, and it's this terrific exploration of a couple who are, Tracy plays an assistant DA, which is what Cukor's father was in New York, actually,
Mm,
and Hepburn is a defense attorney, and they're on opposite sides of the case, and so it's kind of a battle of the sexes, both in the courtroom
yes.
and in their apartment. But it has this feeling of like when two people talk to each other who are married or been together a long time, they talk in kind of shorthand and complete each other's sentences or interrupt each other, and it has that feeling, but it's mostly written. If you look at the
Hmm.
screenplay, it's pretty faithfully rendered in the film, but Tracy was a master at kind of reshaping a line to make it sound more natural coming out of his mouth, and Hepburn could do that too. But they need a director to kind of control them, and that's what Cukor excelled at. But he valued good dialogue. The dialogue in his films is terrific.
Had this question about technique, about Kucher's style of an approach. Um,
Well,
and
the
it,
Jean Renoir I quote in my book is saying
yes.
the director really needs to know everything about film technique, but he or she doesn't want to show it. In other
Hmm.
words, if you flaunt your technique, that's not good. But
No.
if you can have the technique and use it for the service of the actors, in the case of Cukor, he worked through the actors and they expressed him or his text. He called it the text a lot, which is very important
Yeah.
to him. But he
But you. It sounds like you read, in addition to seeing. I mean, obviously, seen every film that is available, right? That Cukor made or was participated in making. Yeah,
Oh yes,
I'm
I
just
read I mean, I analyzed the source material and the scripts.
all the scripts and
And that's very interesting. I wrote a book on screenwriting called Writing in Pictures, and I teach screenwriting through the process of adaptation. I think that's a great way to learn how to write a script, and
so what do
that's
you
how.
do in that case? You take the original source material, maybe, or like a play or a novel.
Well, in my case, I taught myself how to write screenplays back in the '60s, and I couldn't find a book on the subject, so I would take a short story and adapt it. I took a Jack London short story, for example, and I adapted it into a script, and then I adapted a couple books, and to train myself how to write scripts before I could graduate
Hmm.
to writing an original. And that's a great way to teach screenwriting because you have a great writer to work with as a collaborator, and you can focus on the craft. And so with Kukar, I'm zeroing in this book. I have like about 65 portraits of acting performances in his films, whether it's stars or character actors. Some people you haven't really heard much about, but I write about them because they're wonderful in a Kukar film. And I write about them in a kind of granular, microscopic way, describing their physical actions and how they interact with people and how camera follows their body language, which I teach my screenwriting students. Body language is as important as dialogue in a film. And Hitchcock always said people remember images more than words when they
Hmm. Hmm.
remember a film. And but how does the director work with an actor to create these memorable expressions or interactions with other actors? With Tony Perkins in Psycho, a great performance like that with Janet Leigh, and how does that work? And Hitchcock was actually a terrific director of actors. There's a book by Dan Callahan on Hitchcock directing actors. It's called The Camera Lies, and that was one of my um, inspirations in this book. When I looked around and I thought, well, there aren't very many books about acting on film. It's a misunderstood subject.
Yeah.
But Callahan writes really good books. He wrote one on Barbara Stanwyck that was really good, and James Naremore wrote one on Cary Grant that's really good. So I kind of took inspiration from those guys too.
George Cukor's People is the name of the book, and this is you were just mentioning that once again how your structure for the book, which is to kind of go through his films, whether individually or in groups, let's say, of and how uh his vision as a director was almost like the actors were the avatars for that vision for
Yeah.
as opposed to maybe some other directors who more inserted themselves or maybe to completely relied on some sort of technique or maybe the word itself, but George Cukor really realized his vision through his relationship with his actors.
Well, there's
Um,
a kind of a method in Hollywood that Hollywood evolved, the invisible camera, where you're not supposed to notice the
yeah.
camera because, as John Ford told me when I interviewed him, and I've written two books on him, he says the audience shouldn't be interested in the camera. Of course, in a Ford film, the visuals are spectacular compositions, etc.
Hmm.
Cukor doesn't show off his visual sense that much, but in his later work, it becomes more and more lavish. Like after A Star Is Born, when he got into color.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
Justine, which is a film he took over from another director, is a fantastic looking film. That he worked with the greatest cameramen too. Leon Shamroy did Justine, and Travels with My Aunt, Douglas
Hmm.
Slocum. That's really a gorgeous film. Um, but Cukor expressed himself through the performers, and his vision, he picked. It's partly the material you pick and how you interpret it. And he had some very strong preoccupations. I mean, one thing that I always found that I related to a lot was, in The Star Is Born, it's about self-destruction and
Yes.
alcoholism.
Hmm.
And I noticed there are a lot of alcoholics in Cukor films,
Yep.
and I'm
Yep.
I'm a recovering alcoholic myself, and my parents were alcoholics, so I understand the syndrome. And I wondered why Cukor was so fascinated by that. He was not an alcoholic, but he struggled with his weight, and he was emotionally volatile. I think it's kind of a metaphor for uncontrollable forces in your personality that have to be disciplined, or you might destroy yourself. And
Well,
you know,
yeah, and if you can't live openly and honestly, and you have to suppress a core aspect of your very identity, you're going to probably self-medicate. you know?
yeah,
So,
yeah. No, I think that's you
well,
get into that. I mean, it
yeah,
is a really key part of his personality that he was a gay man. He said he didn't like the word gay. He was ahead of the times. He said, I prefer the word queer.
mm, yeah,
That word used to be a slur, and then gay people picked it up as a kind of mark of honor. But that was the kind of yeah, a whole side of his personality that had to be suppressed in a way, but also is reflected in his work because he's ahead of the times in dealing with what we call gender fluidity
right.
and
Going back to Sylvia Scarlett, you're going to talk about, and
yeah.
even to some degree, Little Women, because Katharine Hepburn's performance in that movie, they're playing with kind of gender roles to some degree, and right, cutting
Yeah,
her.
I mean, he directed Hepburn 10 times, and he put her in her first film, A Bill of Divorcement, and he kept working with her into the TV era. And she was known for being unconventional. She wore pants, which was
Right.
shocking at the time.
Yeah.
And she was a kind of androgynous, and he explored the androgyny of her nature. And in Little Women, it's about a young woman who's kind of conflicted about being a dutiful girl in a New England conventional family or going to New York and becoming an author. And it was one of his favorite films. And
Right.
that was her favorite film. She said it really expressed her youth. It's about independent women and rebellion, but also caring deeply about her family. And Hepburn was like that. And but Holiday, she plays a rich young woman who's frustrated and wants to rebel, and it's a terrific performance. And um, all the way through her career, Adam's Rib, Pat and Mike is a marvelous film where she plays a multi-talented athlete who
Hmm.
um, forms a personal and professional partnership with Spencer Tracy, plays her manager, who's kind of a gruff Damon Runyon kind of character, and
Hmm.
um, they don't seem at first to be well suited, but they work out wonderfully together because they respect each other, and it's a wonderful film. It doesn't preach as much as Adam's Rib, but it just exemplifies in the relationship how two people can be equals and partners and
So,
complementary to each other with an E
yeah.
instead, you know.
Well, it gets to this thing that he can do. It's deceptively light in cases where, but the themes that are just beneath the surface there are pretty, significant, and as you just talk about the films, it seems like you can watch it and be just entertained, like, but if you think about it further, and if you kind of watch it multiple times, I'm sure you have most of the films, you realize that he's getting to things that are a little bit more subtle.
Yeah, they're very profound. When you get into the intricacies of human behavior and
Yeah.
relationships, he was not an overtly political filmmaker, except in a couple of cases where, I mean, he worked with some left-wing screenwriters, et cetera, and he's a liberal Democrat,
Hmm.
but he dealt with outsiders. He identified with outsiders, being one himself. He was a
Right.
queer man who was in the closet, and he was Jewish, and he was the son of Hungarian immigrants. So he was kind of used to living on the margins, and he gravitated toward the theater as a young man. He would go to all kinds of plays in New York, and
Yeah.
theater is a way of masquerading and disguising yourself if you're an outsider, and playing roles. And he soon realized an insight that we've just come up with, that gender is a performance, and people are playing roles as men or women. And then in the wonderful Sylvia Scarlett, which you mentioned, I recommend anybody who doesn't know Kukor really well, just take the cold plunge and jump into Sylvia Scarlett is so
Yeah.
wonderful. Katharine Hepburn plays a boy in most of the picture. She's
Yeah.
a
It's
girl
pretty rare.
whose father is a criminal, and so she goes in disguise with him from France to England, and she's a very handsome young man, and so
Yeah, yeah, right.
women and guys both hit on her all through the movie, and
They're,
it's
most of the characters that have crushes are very confused about their
yeah, yeah.
feelings.
Yeah, there's a guy, Brian Ahern is this very good-looking bohemian artist who's attracted to her, but he says,
To her, him.
why do I get a queer feeling every time I look at you? I mean, it's very full of double entendre and
It was
wonderful.
pre-code,
Well, no, it was made after the
was it?
code
It
came
was.
in. It's
Yeah.
amazing they got away with a lot. I don't know how they got, but the audience rejected that film at the
Yeah.
time.
All right.
If you look
It
at the
made them
review,
uncomfortable.
yeah,
Their
yeah,
attraction. They were finding themselves attracted to the
to
to
Hepburn as a
what was the
guy.
name to Sylvester Scarlett.
Sylvester
Yeah.
Scarlett.
Uh
And then she decides at one point to go back to being a girl, and she's a very pretty
yeah.
girl too. And but one of the sweet, funny things about that film when she is a girl, she's very awkward, you know. And
Right.
when she's a boy, she's very kind of with it. And Hepburn in her own personal life was bisexual, and she when she was growing up, she called herself Jimmy because she
Oh,
didn't
I
want to
didn't know
be a
that.
girl. She wanted to be
Wow.
a boy, and she wore pants, and she was what we call a tomboy, or they used to call a
Sure.
tomboy. And but she continued doing that throughout her life, you know. But she kind of had to conform to certain Hollywood norms. And but you know, with Kukor, you can have many things going on at the same time. Uh, People playing roles.
Right. It's so yeah, the queer audiences could have appreciate what he was doing, whereas maybe non-queer audiences didn't get it, but enjoyed it for the comedy and other aspects of it. It's interesting he could pull that off.
Yeah, yeah, you know, Adam's Rib became a favorite in the 70s, you know, when feminism became a big thing in America.
Yes.
And it was a very liberated kind of character she played. And but it's a good study of a couple too. And Cukor to me is like E.M. Forster, the great novelist who was gay. He was known for his ability to write knowingly about male female relationships, marriage or courtship or whatever, because as an outsider he could observe it more objectively than people who were
Yeah.
in the midst of it. So Cukor could navigate all different worlds, and Hepburn as well. And but in Adam's Rib, you know, who wears the pants is kind of the joke, and they're both kind of competing for dominance in the courtroom, and it's it's a very lively screenplay. But Pat and Mike does it in a way that's a little more organic, in my opinion.
Hmm.
But those are wonderful movies that Gordon and Kanan wrote, and then he worked with Judy Holliday too, and
Yeah.
she was a marvelous actress, and he did four
Born
movies with
yes.
her.
More
Born
most famously
Yesterday,
Born Yesterday, which
the the Marrying Kind is wonderful, but Born Yesterday she won an Oscar. She's
if it
terrific,
could
and
happen to you.
yeah, yeah, she's kind of a slightly mannish actress, but very feminine at the same time, and has that androgynous quality too. And she's very funny and very charming. And he said she was so subtle she could play not only the commas in a line, but semicolon if you had a semicolon
I
line,
like that.
you know. And
Yeah.
she is marvelous in his work. And she had some trouble with the blacklist, but he loyally kept uh, employing her. She didn't make as many movies as she should have because of the blacklist, but she shines in the Cukor films.
Yeah, she was able to kind of borrow her persona a little bit to kind of slip through the um the blacklist period a bit, and being pulled in front of whatever committee and being questioned. She kind of was able to lean on her persona as a bit of a dumb blonde, not really understanding what was going
Yeah,
work towards her
and
advantage.
Lucille Ball did that before HUAC. You know,
But she was a
Luc
communist.
yeah, she actually was a
Yeah,
communist in the
yeah,
30s, and
yeah.
she was the top TV star, and so what she did brilliantly before HUAC was to play the Lucy character, the ditzy
Did she start to
character. Like,
cry?
oh, I didn't realize what I was doing when I signed that petition, and blah blah blah.
Yeah, right.
Judy Holliday was got a little like Lucille Ball, but
Yeah,
apparently, I mean, from what everybody says, an extremely intelligent woman who
right.
played ditzy characters really well, and that was part of her forte. But Cukor said she could get you from comedy to drama more deeply and quickly than anybody else that
Yeah,
we worked with. And The Marrying Kind is a marvelous film, and the title suggests, an outsider looking at the institution of marriage and the problems and the benefits of marriage, but also the struggles and difficulties of marriage. It's a very poignant film. Deals with a couple whose child dies, and it's
yeah.
about grief.
I didn't want to see that one, but I eventually need to. I guess I did take I did get to at least see at least four or five films that I had not seen of his, and I rewatched Born yesterday and seen that in a really long time. So it was such a pleasure to see that. And it's a great example of, I mean, there are great examples within that film of what you were talking about in terms of her shift from comedy to drama, with Broderick Crawford being in a very abusive husband, or rather, fiance,
Yeah,
not a husband. That was part of you got marry her fast.
yeah,
um,
yeah.
yeah, it was terrific to see that again.
What else did you see that you hadn't seen
Well, I
before?
had not seen Sylvia Scarlett. I had
Hmm.
not seen what else did I watch? I never saw Let's Make Love with Marilyn
Oh,
Monroe. You didn't
yeah,
mention Marilyn Monroe and her last finished performance, finished film.
yeah. Well, she did The Misfits for John
Oh, she
Huston
did do that
after
one
that.
afterwards
Yeah,
for
that was her last finished film.
she did the Misfits for John Huston. Was that her last film? Yeah, it was her last film, Gable's last film,
Well,
and
it's her last finished film.
finished film. Because
But then Cukor
you
directed
gotta,
her.
yeah, you
Cuk- I'm
something's
sorry,
got to give was not
you
finished.
can edit all this mishmash.
If or I'll hand it off to somebody. Uh, something's got to give.
Yeah,
It was the unfinished
yeah, yeah. I write about that,
film
and
with
a
D.
lot
Martin.
has been written about that troubled production where
Yeah,
Monroe was falling apart. I mean, and
yeah.
I feel for her in a strong way. I was a huge Monroe fan as a kid. When I saw Some Like It Hot, even before that, I was a Monroe fan. I mean, she was kind of my sex idol as a kid.
Oh my God, of
Wow,
course.
she's
Well,
so
yes, Siren.
wonderful.
Yeah, she's so terrific in Let's Make Love. I mean, there's actually some moments that where she transcends from the her persona as the sex pot. Even though she leans on that still, but there's moments where in some scenes, um, right? Who else is in that film now?
Well, she's very vulnerable.
Yeah,
She's in love with Yves Montand.
you're right, Eve Montana, of course,
Yeah.
but she thinks he's some sort of poor, struggling.
Well, she doesn't realize. I mean, it's
Yeah,
a clever idea for a film that didn't quite come off. That they're doing an off-Broadway uh, review that satirizes this billionaire character played by Yves Montand, and he applies for the role, and they don't
right,
realize that he's the real guy, and
right.
he has to learn how to play himself. And unfortunately, Montand didn't speak English very well, and so his English is really
He had to do everything
limited.
phonetically. Is that what happened?
Yeah, yeah, it was just he's so awkward in that film.
Yeah,
But you know who steals that film, oddly enough, is
Milton Berle.
Milton Berle. He's just wonderful, wonderful.
He really
They,
is great in that. Yeah,
they,
he's
they,
not. I won't say the same for Gene Kelly or Bing Crosby, barely in a moment of it.
yeah,
But you're right. They bring in these coaches who play themselves.
yeah.
But Milton Berle, like I noticed, he has the longest amount of screen time of those three coaches for a very good reason, as you're referring to. He's really great on camera, and he's great in that role. And you see, wow, he could have actually maybe been had a larger role in a film like that, or
Well, he's got a good stretch of time. I think it's about 13 minutes where he's trying to teach Montan to be funny, and
Yeah.
the gag is kind of that Montan is hopelessly unfunny, and Milton Berle has to pretend that he's funny because he's getting paid to do this, but he's actually kind of looking at him and kind of with horror, like this guy is hopeless. It's
Yeah.
really terrific, a wonderful performance. That's Cukor, like Frank Capra, did this too. That he could take a character actor or a small part actor and make them really memorable in a film. And Capra said, "I treat every actor as a star, whether they have 1 minute part or 5 minute part."
Oh,
And Cukor did that too. And so I write about some of these character actors in his films. A great example is one of my favorite actresses, Hattie McDaniel, in Gone with the Wind. Cukor started directing Gone with the Wind, and he was fired by David O. Selznick. But Vivian Leigh and Olivia de Havilland were so upset that they would come to his house on the weekends and run the scenes with him, and he would direct them surreptitiously. And so he had a huge influence all the way through. But he cast the great Hattie McDaniel and directed an early scene with her and Scarlett O'Hara that's wonderful, where she's lacing up Scarlett at a barbecue, and Scarlett is being rebellious, and she keeps trying to pull her uh, dress down to show off her breasts, and McDaniel's trying to pull it up, and she's the guardian of propriety in this family. She said, nobody else cares about this family, I do.
yeah.
And McDaniel was great because she was the only black actor in Hollywood in that racist period who could talk back to white people on the screen and get
And
away
get
with
away
it
with it. Yeah.
because she was so funny and she was so strong that the audience really enjoyed her. And Cukor evolved this great performance out of her that she continued doing, and she was the first black person to win an Oscar. And that's an example. But Olivia de Havilland is fantastic in that film, and Vivian Leigh, and Clark Gable, unfortunately, was uncomfortable being directed by a gay director, and he made his feelings known in a very rude way on the set.
And so you feel like that was indeed why, because that's the always been the rumor, right? That Clark Gable had him thrown off the picture, and Victor Fleming was brought in to replace him.
That's part
Um,
of it. Yeah, there was more going on. That
yeah.
Cukor resented Selznick, the producer, controlling everything, and Selznick, he was micromanaging.
So there's a power struggle,
Well,
or
for example, he wanted to come on the set and watch a rehearsal of every scene before they could film it, and that's really interfering with the director's role.
yeah.
And Cukor couldn't handle that, and he couldn't stand for that, and he rebelled. Also, he thought the script was inadequate, and they had like 10 screenwriters, and he wanted to go back to the original screenplay by Sidney Howard, and they more or less did. But they brought in Ben Heck to rewrite the script in a week. There's famous.
There must be a good book on that.
Well, there's a wonderful play called.
Yeah.
I think it's called Moonlight and Magnolias. And it's a play about Ben Hecht rewriting Gone with the Wind in a week. The gag, and this is real. He hadn't read the book, and Selznick called him in, and he was like the most highly paid screenwriter in Hollywood, and he was known for writing fast, but he hadn't read the book, and Selznick freaked out. You haven't read the book? Everybody in America has read this book. He said, I don't
He
know.
won the Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah, so he said, "Well, tell me the story." So Fleming and Selznick had to tell Ben Heck the story, which he thought was absurd.
Yeah.
Like, who is this guy Ashley? What is he doing? Why is he always hanging around? Why is she in love with this? I mean, it was really funny. It's a very funny play, but this is the kind of mishigas that was going on behind the scenes. So Cukor, in a sense, was almost glad to be relieved of this job, but he spent 2 years of his life going around on this search for Scarlet, where they were testing actresses all over the country. And you can see a lot of the screen tests there on YouTube and other places. And uh, one of the things he did, he said, I probably did more tests of actors than anybody else. That was one way he got to know certain actresses and actors that he
Right.
worked with later. He met them and worked with them, rehearsing and then remembered them for later roles. He was very loyal, by the way, to just to give an example of CUKOR'S great talent for friendship and his loyalty, he put a lot of old actors and actresses in his
Yes.
films to help them keep up their health benefits, and
Yeah. Right.
things like that, and keep them alive. And so you see all these familiar faces in his work. And when I was at Variety in the 1970s, Cukor
Oh
held
yeah.
a luncheon at Universal for
Right.
Gertrude Astor, who was a silent film actress who had been in some John Ford films and Frank Capra films. And Cukor had known her for a long time, and he kept putting her in the background of his pictures as an extra. So they had all the young actors who were under contract at Universal gathered around this table with members of the press. And Alan Dwan came, the silent film director who had directed Gertrude Astor. And it was so touching and sweet. And afterwards, I went outside on the studio street, and Gertrude Astor was standing there with a big bouquet of roses that Cooper had given her, and she was weeping as she was waiting for her limo to take her home. And that's the kind of guy he was. He was so loyal and
Generous. Very, very
kind to
generous.
actors. Very
Yeah.
generous man. Yeah.
Um, we'll wind it down, I think, a little bit, but I would have to ask you uh briefly what your takeaway from this project is, because something had to have emerged for you. And maybe it sounds like, you know, his his generosity, maybe it could be that, but what you kind of found out of that maybe you didn't know going into the project,
Well, yeah, his deep.
because you did so much research ahead of time, as you know, and for years probably.
Yeah, I thought about this for a long time. I mean, I do that a lot when I write about some great director. I mean, I study their works for decades, and then I gradually get around to writing the book. And but I was struggling with how to write about Cukor, and I hit on the idea of writing about him through portraits of his actors' performances and micro analyzing them and doing it in a way that is entertaining to that.
Yes.
I don't do just plot synopses and that kind of boring thing, but I write about the moment by moment, entertaining things that they do, and how does Cukor get them to do that? I mean, for example, just one example people will remember in Star is Born, after Frederick March commits suicide, Judy Garland is almost catatonic. She's in her library at her home in Malibu, and it's a dark set, brown lighting, brown decor, and she's wearing a brown outfit and everything. And she's sitting in this dim light, and her band leader pal, Tommy Noonan, comes to get her, and he says, "You're expected at the Shrine Auditorium for this, benefit." That's where she will do the famous line, "This is Mrs. Norman Maine." But
Right.
she doesn't want to move because she's in a state of profound grief. And she Cukor, she gets very angry, and she kind of erupts when he accuses her of letting down the memory of her dead husband. And she
You
it's
said Frederick March.
oh, did I say Frederick March?
Yes, you meant, of course, not Frederick March, but
James
you meant
Mason.
James Mason is what you meant to
Yeah.
say.
Can I do this again?
No, no, it's okay. I like correcting Joe McBride. Come on, leave me
Okay.
one.
Yeah, yeah. James Mason. Oh, yeah,
Frederick
I'm
March
sorry.
was in the earlier
Frederick
version.
March was in the first Star is Born
So
film.
he does indeed commit suicide.
Yeah, but he plays the husband who's a faded movie star who kills himself,
Right.
partly sacrifices his own career for
Yeah.
the woman he loves. And so in this film, Mason has killed himself. It's a powerful scene. But Garland is sitting there, and she doesn't want to move, and Tommy Noonan is berating her for giving up on life, basically. And she erupts, and it's this harrowing explosion of emotion, really powerful. And what Cukor did was he just went over to Judy Garland and quietly said, "Now you really understand this. You really understand this." I mean, they had kind of a shorthand because
Yes.
he
Yes.
knew he knew that she had a tempestuous life, and she had been through the depths. And so
Holy
she
Moses. Yeah.
she did this great scene. And then he said, "Let's do it again quickly because maybe there'll be a scratch on the negative or something, and let's do one for protection." So they did it again, and she was really good again. And then he went over to her and he said, "You really frightened me. I mean, you really scared me with your
Yeah, she
intensity."
was intense. She could be
And
very intense. I mean,
and she said to him, "Well, that's nothing. You should come around the house. I do this every afternoon." And then, but she said, "But I only do it once at home, you know." And he also kidded her. He
yeah.
said, "You did it better than Kay Francis would have done." And Kay Francis was an actress he had directed early in his career, who was, a fun actress, but didn't have the depth that Judy Garland had. But he always knew the right thing to say to people,
Okay. Yeah.
and he did that to me. When I first met him, I was impressed. In 1975, I interviewed him for the Directors Guild magazine about The Bluebird, which was the film he made in Russia, which was a complete debacle. Everything went wrong. And he came back to Hollywood, and he was a real survivor, because he had been through the mill with Gone with the Wind and everything, but he always bounced back. And so I said to him, "What's it like being fired from a film?" And I was actually thinking of a film called Desire Me, which was an MGM film from which he was fired. And Cukor leaned over to his publicist and he put his hand on my forearm and he said to the publicist, "Notice with what finesse he avoids mentioning the title Gone with the Wind." I thought that was such a wonderfully witty,
Well, he was.
humorous thing. And that's the
Yeah.
kind of spirit he had of survival. But he said something in that in a meeting that we had that really moved me. He looked at me and he said, "You're a very mild mannered young man, but you always get what you want."
Hmm.
And he said, "Keep that." And I
Yeah.
thought, wow, he really understands me, because that was kind of a layer of my personality that most people didn't understand. That
Hmm.
some people thought I was just a
Interesting.
very mild mannered young man, but I'm a pretty determined guy. And he saw that. And,
Well, it goes back to an earlier point when you maybe live in the margins. I mean, on socially speaking, personally speaking, you get better at observation because you're not just one of the boys, and you can see shades of people that you can relate to, and that you see it in yourself. You're open and honest. He wasn't like he knew he was gay, and he knew he um, had a different sides to him that he could have relate to others, in that way. So he was very perceptive, obviously, and
yeah, he had a great insight into human nature, and that's what
yeah,
I took away from
right.
that. And
Hence the
yeah,
book.
hence the book. And that's why I
Yeah.
dealt with the George Cukor's people. Actually, let me just conclude by reading a little quote that I used as the epigraph of the book. Katharine Hepburn said to Cukor once, "You never had to put a label on the bottle because it was unmistakable. All the people in your pictures are as goddamn good as they can possibly be, and that's your stamp."
She was perceptive too, obviously.
Yeah.
The two of them. Um, and then, lastly, I mean, are you on to another, or do you have one in mind for your next project?
Yeah,
Because
I'm retiring as a teacher after
right.
22 years from San Francisco State University, and I've done a lot of books over that time. And I've been writing books continuously since I was a teenager in 1963. And
The
I'm
year I was
actually,
born.
oh, wow. Wow, geez. Well, I've been working on another one. Paul Cronin has a little book company called Sticking Place Books, and he's commissioned several film critics to do interview books about their careers, reflecting on the history of film and the film medium and how we study it. And he asked me to do one. And my friend Danny Perry, who's written a lot of
Yes.
terrific film books, he also has written great books on baseball, and I'm a
Right.
baseball
I know.
fan.
Yeah.
My first book was a study of baseball slang called High and Inside. And so Danny and I are doing this interview book, and I'm reflecting on my career, which is unusual in that I've had four kind of careers that are sort of overlapping. One is journalist, another is screenwriter,
Uh-huh.
and another is book writer, and then
Okay.
teacher. So I've had these four careers that kind of
Right.
kind of influence each other, and it's a confluence of things. And so I'm having fun looking back over that, and then I'll move on to something
Well,
else,
I would
whatever.
like to bring you and Danny on, maybe around the time that comes out. That would be a good way to go.
Do you know
Um,
Danny? Do you know Danny?
yeah, I
Yeah,
do. Yeah,
good.
yeah. He's a New York guy.
Yeah, he's an old friend from college. I went to
Wow.
college in
Can't believe that.
Madison,
Yeah, he's got a
with him
great.
and his brother Jerry, the two guys.
Yeah, right. I was funny. I was with my partner, and she got a cramp in her leg, and I said, "Oh, you have a Charlie horse," and she didn't never. She's Danish.
Oh,
She's been here a long time, but she's Danish. So she said, "What does that term mean?" And I'm like, "I don't know the origin." So,
yeah.
do you know what it is?
Well, that's a baseball.
You're right.
It is a sports term.
Correct.
And it has to do, if I remember correctly, with somebody had an old lame horse named Charlie, and they started
Correct.
saying, "You walk like Charlie, the horse."
Yes, that's where it
Uh,
comes from. It's a
yeah,
baseball term. I thought you might appreciate my knowing that, but
yeah, that's good. That's good. I
it's,
appreciate that too.
um, all right. Listen, Joe McBride, George Cukor's people, um, enjoy it, read it. It's not terribly, I mean, it's like a little over 400 pages, but it's a very, very easy read. It's really rather enjoyable. And as always, what I always recommend people do is to make you can have a companion experience as I tried to do, more or less, and that is to watch the films as you read the book because they're mostly available out there. So there's no
Yeah,
reason.
hope
Great.
it leads people to some films they haven't seen, or
Yeah, that's exactly what I did, and I
yeah.
love that. I wish I had more time. I could have caught a few more, but uh, you know,
Well, it's
I'll do it eventually.
that's why we write books I mean, to give a
Right,
great director his due,
right,
and encourage people to see the films and appreciate
right,
them
right.
on a deeper level than they've been appreciated before. We hope,
Good
anyway.
point.
Yeah,
Good point.
yeah.
Thank you so much, as always.
Thank you, Adam. It's great to be with you. I
Yeah,
really
appreciate it.
appreciate it. Yeah,
All right. All right. Well, I'll be in touch. Happy holidays to you, and congratulations on this next chapter in or the end of this chapter and stepping
yeah,
into the next.
yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.